Greetings, Dr. Joseph Martin. Meister Eckhart, 13th century mystic and philosopher. Now, as I've said before, isn't it interesting that over the last 700 years, as in all history, we forget all the names of the popes and the priests and the politicians and prime ministers and presidents and even the names of great people like the monarchs of all the different nations. But we do remember those people who stand out because of their spiritual courage, purity of mind and heart, and such a person is Meister Eckhart. He lived from 1260 to 1328. That's about 700 years ago now, and he lived a life of 68 years. It was a challenging time. It was still the Dark Ages. He lived in Gotha in Germany. He was a Dominican monk. He was a preacher. He was a theologian, and he was definitely a well-educated academic. And through all his meditations and his inner visions that he had, his conversations with God and with the Christ and with Jesus, he became one of the greatest mystics of all time. And I'll explain how he did that, not through any acceptance at the time he was living. The Franciscans and Pope John the 22nd accused him of heresy, and they spent decades chasing him around Europe while he was preaching in different churches and cathedrals to the lay people who loved him extremely, and while he was writing a lot of his works in Latin, of which there are many, and you can find them all now translated in English online. Meister Eckhart was one of the ones that I read when I was very ill as a teenager, and I used to read a lot of his works, and he inspired me greatly, and I know and hope and trust that he will with you as well. Now, Meister Eckhart, actually, just to complete the story, he died just before the Inquisition, which was on at the time, killing and murdering many innocent people of the time just because they didn't believe in what the Pope and the Catholic Church claimed to be the truth. In their power struggles using force and fear and intimidation. He actually died before they were just about to catch him and not only excommunicate him, but probably burn him at the stake, as they did with many others back then. Nevertheless, all those popes and people who were trying to do that have been lost in the mists of history, and Meister Eckhart is still alive with us here today. What is it about him that created such a magnanimous and good character? Basically, it's this: through his struggles with the church, being alone all the time, being harassed and intimidated and chased around Europe, I guess is the best way of putting it, he created such a spiritual strength and such a purity of heart and a goodness in his soul that he was well loved by all the people at that time. And here's a quote from him. He said, "When I preach," and he used metaphorical languages like Jesus, he used storytelling and parables. He, even though he was a major academic of his time and still now, he just used simple stories, parables, and metaphors and imagery to inspire and encourage the local lay people who couldn't even read. And he said, "I try and I do inspire my listeners, above all, just to do good and be good." Isn't that great? Now, it was 100 years later that Nicholas of Cusa, another well-known mystic and academic, in the 1430s, had all of Meister Eckhart's works in Latin and started translating them into other languages. And there were a few people in the United Kingdom at the time who also were doing some of the same. However, it wasn't until the 19th century, so likely 600 years later, that some of the documents of Meister Eckhart were found again in archives, written in Latin, and translated into English and German and French and other languages. And so Meister Eckhart has become a hugely popular spiritual mentor and model of the spiritual life in now the 20th century and the 21st century. And let me go into that in a way. And I want to explain to you what are the basic principles or experiences of his life that allowed him, through all his suffering and pain and sorrow, to have such a good heart and a pure mind and maintain a balance and equilibrium. And these are the things that he said that one needed to experience as a good human being. He said, experience the presence of God in your individual soul. And know that the nobility and dignity of your soul is magnanimous and in you at all times. Be empty and stay empty and just listen to the Spirit. Reconstruct your goodness out of all your failures and your evil actions and thoughts. Reconstruct your goodness. And remember at all times that you have a purity of spiritual nature, that you are one with the divine spark of all that is in the source. Always hold on to that and remember that. Remember that God the Father ebulliently and energetically, playfully, always creates goodness and joy in you for your life every day and every night. And he wants to create the Christ consciousness within you as you stay open, stay empty, and surrender to that. And mostly he wanted to say that there is a love of God for us all, no matter who we are, good, evil, indifferent. There is a love of God for us all. Now, you know, a great definition of normalcy, or banality, if you like, is the inability to recognize reality. And so the inability to recognize that God loves us is perhaps the one greatest issue of why almost 95% of people on the planet experience loneliness, depression, meaninglessness, meanderings, and just absolute sadness, grief, and endless nothingness in their lives. They're unaware of the reality of what is in their divine spark hidden in their soul, in their heart and mind and body. Well, now, how important is this in the 20th and 21st century? The ex-Dominican priest, monk, Matthew Fox, and he has many, many books, who started Creation Spirituality, and I've met him and read all his books, as a matter of fact, spends a lot of his time in his writings focusing on Meister Eckhart and everything he's learned from this much more ancient, earlier Dominican himself. Other than that, there are many people in our time who have devoted their own search and their own writing and their own honorings and efforts in the world to have been based on Meister Eckhart, his writings, his teachings, and his own spiritual life experiences. And who are these people? Well, we have the modern day Buddhists, we have the Theosophists, we have all the anthroposophists, including Dr. Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy. We have the great philosopher Schopenhauer, who's one of my favorite German philosophers. We have Eckhart Tolle, the power of now. He actually changed his first name to Eckhart because he wanted to honor Meister Eckhart, from whom Eckhart Tolle got most of his ideas, and honors him in that way. Maybe you knew that. Also, we have the Neo-Vedantists, and as I've said, Vedanta is a spiritual philosophy that is timeless, and we have a couple of videos, YouTubes on that as well, that you'd like to like and share with all your friends if you're enjoying this knowledge base here. And one of them is Swami Vivekananda, and another one on Vedanta itself. Psychoanalysis and psychiatry in the mid-20th century was based through Erich Fromm, whom I consider to be, other than Carl Jung, the greatest psychiatrist, psychoanalyst of the 20th century. His books on the art of loving, Escape from Freedom, many, many other books, The Destructiveness of Human Nature. He was a psychoanalyst, psychiatrist, and he was a social cultural sociologist, a philosopher, and he had read all of Meister Eckhart. And from Meister Eckhart, he got the unity and the purity of spiritual psychology and human nature. Because as you reread Erich Fromm, and I encourage you to reread them, these are books all written around the 1950s and 60s and 70s. You will see that in that there's a great hope and a great strength of a deeply understanding and understandable psychology. He wrote for the common people, and academics were never as popular as he was. He's still now in 32 languages of the world. His books are published 50 years later after his passing. And that's because of the power of the courage and the strength that he took through his own experience and his spiritual path and journey to bring the simplicity and the beauty of the love of God, if you like, of the Creator, and how that's central and core to our goodness and our peace of mind, our harmony and balance, and mostly our emotional and psychological maturity as we grow. Erich Fromm, Dr. Erich Fromm, The Art of Loving, The Courage to Be. Those are two books there. Now, other than that, there were many other people. Thomas Aquinas, who is one of perhaps the greatest Catholic theologian of recent times, and every Catholic would say that. And even though 600-700 years have passed, the Catholic Church has never decided whether or not Meister Eckhart is a heretic. Even though there's so many people in the modern world who use his ideas and give him so many kudos. Well, Pope John Paul XXIII used to quote some of Meister Eckhart, but he never went so far as to release him from the heretical accusation, which we know is all just bogus anyways. Isn't it interesting in the history of revolutions, whether the revolution is a spiritual revolution like the one we're talking about, or a revolution in science and the changes in science and theories of science, or a revolution in philosophy or psychology, that it's always the true visionaries who come up with a more purified, true way of understanding the theory of knowledge and human nature, that they're the ones that are put down. And of course, it's through the ones who don't have that experience, through their fear, anxiety, and greed and power mongering, they have to put them down. And back in the day, burn them at the stake, or these days, just shame them and throw them out of the church, excommunicate them. Nevertheless, this is all changing as all these institutions of false ideologies change and die as this true spiritual nature that individuals have in their heart comes to the fore now in the consciousness of the 21st century and in 500 and 5,000 years to come. So we're on the positive wave, the next wave of true individualized spiritual psychology and experience, all based on the goodness you experience in your heart. And if you listen to my Yakobuma previous YouTube, you'll see how the bad and the good and the evil, the dark and the light have to come together in your conscious spiritual transformation. Now, there are just a few other people I wanted to mention who were very, very involved in this process. Another one is a Christian theologian, Paul Tillich, who you may be interested in. But mostly I want to focus on, to close here, Dag Hammarskjöld. Dag Hammarskjöld was an economist and an author and a philosopher from Sweden. And he was the second Secretary General of the United Nations shortly after it was formed in the 1950s. He was an out gay man, and there was very few of them at that time. And he was well liked because of his big build and his ebullient, friendly nature, even though he was very much an introvert and a very humble man, very humble indeed. He died tragically in a plane crash, ended his very short life in his late 40s. And it was found in his home a series of diaries and journals that he had been writing through his life. It was subsequently posthumously published under the book title in English called Markings. It was published in 1963, and I read it in that year that it was published. Now, he was the only person to ever have been posthumously given the Nobel Peace Prize. The introduction to Dag Hammarskjöld's book Markings was by one of my favorite British poets and poets of all time, who I also had the good fortune to meet, W.H. Auden, a fellow gay poet like Dag Hammarskjöld. The book Markings itself is some prose with a lot of haiku poetry, which he liked to write. And it's his musings about his struggle, his spiritual struggle, and his emotional struggle to be pure in heart and be active in the world to support and help as many people as he could, which is why he has been and was the youngest Secretary General that the UN ever hired or selected. But I want to just share a few of these last things, and of course these are all based on Meister Eckhart. Dag Hammarskjöld said that everything he learned from Meister Eckhart and his readings, and the personal life of Meister Eckhart and his struggles. And so here's what Dag Hammarskjöld said. Self-surrender is the path to self-realization. Self-surrender, and that means sacrifice to others, is the path to self-realization. One has to have singleness of mind and singleness of purpose in life to attain all that you can attain. You need to have a supreme quality of inwardness. Inwardness meaning introspection, self-realization, meditation, journal writing, prayer, however it is for you, but you need inwardness to find out who you are and find and touch and live that courage and strength. And here's what W.H. Auden said about him in closing here, about Dag Hammarskjöld and his book on Markings. He was of the noblest self-disclosure of the spiritual struggle and triumph of his spiritual struggle, and he showed immense courage and purity of heart. I wish the same for you. I know in your journey you're experiencing all these challenges. You will triumph. You may wish to read Meister Eckhart and all the ways that he's been brought forward to the 20th and 21st centuries. Again, a supreme model of righteousness and overcoming and struggle and surrender and inward self-realization, which is always the key that we find in these spiritual masters who, against all odds and against all political and religious institutions, against all the challenges of their time, and against all poverty and all other kinds of issues, joblessness and so on, you too, like Meister Eckhart and Jakob Böhme, can find the faith and the strength and the courage to overcome all your challenges and difficulties and become a victor and victorious in all the things that you are and you do. All love and blessings to you, Dr. Joseph Martin. Om Namah Shivaya.